When I heard the first iteration of NSF results back, I was like, okay, so it didn't really work out. Basically, the comments were varied. There were basically comments that were like, okay, your proposal is solid. And then there were comments where it was like, okay, what is even the application of your work? And is it even physics?
With a writing deadline, it's really easy to procrastinate on it. How did you get involved with fellowships? How did you start working on it? How did you set goals to start early and keep working on this kind of amorphous, far out deadline?
That's a really good question. I would say the process even started when I heard the first iteration of NSF results back. So I would say like when I heard those results and when I was finalizing grad school, I was like, okay, so it didn't really work out. And the funny thing was that time when I applied for NSF, I was applying in the physics category. And in that category, basically the comments were varied. There were basically comments that were like, okay, your proposal is solid. And then there were comments where it was like, okay, what is even the application of your work? And is it even physics? So I got comments basically all across the spectrum.
Yeah.
And I realized, okay, then I guess either my work wasn't very well communicated to a broad audience, or maybe I just didn't even understand the fact that it was not really a proposal. Perhaps it wasn't even a proposal for a fellowship, and it was just a list of ideas. And I sort of realized that maybe I have to sort of compromise certain aspects of my interest to create a good proposal. During the summer between undergrad and grad school, I was part of a workshop at a national lab. And during that time, I again did some more research on this field. And I also attended some of the info sessions at Purdue for fellowships, including the NSF Fellowship. And I used that opportunity to get connected with one of the grant writers who runs the fellowship workshops. And she gave me some feedback on my previous iteration of NSF. And I thought that feedback was really useful because there were certain aspects that I didn't really see, partially because at a school like Penn, even though you do science and engineering, the way you approach the subject is a lot more fundamental than maybe a lot of other people would approach the subject. Getting that perspective into the field was kind of illuminating because I didn't really see the questions that others might ask. That was really important in setting myself up for the second round of applying for NSF. And I guess this time I applied to NSF, NDSEG, and the DOE Computational Science Fellowship as well. So when I first joined Purdue, I had sort of like, I guess, an outline of my work for the first 2 years of grad school that outlined a set of objectives and just a very high level sort of motivation for why the work I'm doing on statistical modeling of energetic materials is useful for modeling these high energy systems, and moreover also just the general science of granular systems. And I feel like sort of gaining an appreciation of the field sort of allowed me to sort of bridge the literature review that I did the previous time and sort of finding other references and sort of trying to make a very focused connection between network science and energetic materials. And I guess that was sort of the theme around which I crafted my proposal for this iteration.
So how many times did you revise your fellowship?
That's a good question. So this time I actually revised it at least 10 times, and I emailed it several times to the fellowship office, and they gave different levels of feedback. So the first iteration was mainly just seeing the structure of my proposal and whether it made sense for the fellowship. So that was the first thing. And then the second thing was making sure that the ideas came through clearly. So for example, if I'm giving a proposal to you who are an experimentalist, would you be able to understand what are my steps I'm going to execute, and what are the results and what are the insights I'm going to get, and how I'm going to analyze it, and how that relates to the real world application of energetic materials? Could someone who has a very general background in science and engineering understand what my work is? And then once I had those things in line, one thing I realized was that the draft of my proposal was way over the page limit. And I think looking back in retrospect, that was actually a good thing because that allowed me to just flesh out all my thoughts, whether they were good or bad. And then I guess what I had to do afterwards was cut it down. So cut down a lot of text and really focus my ideas into sections. So one thing I did this year that was different from last year was I had section headers. And those section headers allowed the reader to sort of just see how the different topics that I was sort of integrating relate together. So in my case, I sort of had a section on granular systems and a section on energetic materials. And then this proposal part sort of tied together both these areas of knowledge to sort of come up with a proposal that uses ideas from granular systems to basically understand the dynamic behavior of energetic materials. And then I could sort of segue into the approach, the modeling approach, and then the analysis of probability distributions. And that was where I was able to infuse ideas from network science and statistical mechanics, because at the end of the day, any material can be represented as a set of distributions embedded in time and space. And if you could come up with a way to study these distributions and see how the connection between geometry and topology in these systems result in emergent behavior that leads to these really explosive events, then you can sort of make this connection much more evident and defined. And I feel like that was really, I think, the crucial aspect of writing these fellowships, in that I could define the connection explicitly, come up with a plan for how I'm going to execute the proposal, and show how I'm going to evaluate my methods and ensure that it can be applied in an applied setting. And I feel like being able to sort of think in this mindset in comparison to what I was used to was sort of, I guess, a change for me, because I wasn't used to writing a proposal in this way. But at the same time, I also realized that, oh, wow, like a proposal has to be something that can be done, not just something that's an idea that sounds cool, but doesn't really have substance.
This is one of the greater lessons that I've also learned from grad school, is the distinction between an idea and what the work actually looks like. Because like you said, when you're an undergrad, your projects are really scoped out. And so to you, it sort of seems like, oh, I just have this idea and they're telling me what to do. But when you're a grad student, you actually have to figure out like how does this actually get translated into a real project? Another thing I wanted to ask is, it sounds like the content and the kind of like fundamental stuff you're talking about is similar between the different fellowship applications, but how did you specifically tailor it for the NDSEG or for NSF, given that they have different goals and aims?
That's a really good question. And also in this particular cycle, I guess one of the challenges was that energetic materials has a very clear defense application. So I guess when I was writing NSF, I had to sort of write it in a way where I wrote about energetic materials, but I sort of posed it as an example system for a broad range of problems in granular systems, and particularly in the manufacturing industry. So I sort of tried to frame it in more of a societal applications. I spoke about, for example, food processing, for example, batteries. And basically, all of these systems that we see around us are effectively particulate systems, and particulate systems are ubiquitous, basically second to water. So I basically had to emphasize the societal impact of these materials. And I sort of had to talk about energetic materials in a way that I didn't really get too focused on the defense applications of energetic materials, but rather pose that problem as a model problem for a broad range of particulate materials. For example, you can think of lithium ion batteries. And when you apply a bunch of electric fields and external loads, you're going to find that these battery cells degrade over time. And even in those applications, you could think of an application of energetic materials in the sense that they're going to be localized events that lead to overall failure. And that's really the underlying question in network science, which is studying the resilience of networks. You could think of a process spreading on a network that alters the structure of the network itself. And the question is, how do these two things interact with each other, and what's the coupling between these things, a process on a network and the structure of the network? So effectively, there's two aspects, structures and dynamics. And that was sort of the thing I was trying to unpack in a proposal in a way where someone from energetic materials, someone from mechanical engineering, someone from all these different fields could sort of understand and take away different things. And I had to sort of frame the NSF sort of as a broader proposal where I didn't necessarily focus just on energetic materials, but the broader impact of my work for particulate processing and engineering. So I kind of focused on that. And then in the personal statement, I guess I made a couple of changes. So I focused a lot more on the impacts of my broader impact. So it's not just, oh, I'm going to propose these activities associated with my research, but what is the direct impacts and how do you measure those impacts? It's not just about you doing something. It's about why you're doing something. Have you done something before that demonstrates broader impact? I had to sort of frame my broader impact proposal in a more defined way. And I had to think about what are the opportunities for broader impact that exist within the scope of my opportunities that I had at Purdue. And I sort of learned about, for example, NanoHub. And NanoHub basically has a lot of open source workshops. So I was thinking maybe I could have a way to sort of train undergrads on working with computational code. So I proposed activities on that regard, and also working with students from community colleges, which is again another program that Purdue has. So I sort of had to learn about the opportunities that exist at Purdue for broader impacts, and understanding how I could integrate those activities seamlessly with my academic research activities.
Mm-hmm. Specifically with NSF, your broader impact is just like a specific rubric item that they're rating you on. I think the other one that's like the scientific one is like your intellectual merit. And then I remember for NDSEG, it's a lot of stuff about like, what's the relevance of this to the DoD?
Yes.
So like there's a specific, like these proposals have specific like rubrics basically that you have to fit and hit. How did you how did you like demonstrate some of these things like broader impact? I think what's really important, and that I've heard a lot, there's kind of this idea of show, don't tell. And it kind of goes back into the idea of like, you know, you can be really passionate about, like, I'm really passionate about helping people, but like, that doesn't really say a lot. Like, you're passionate about helping people, but how does that compare to someone who actually has already helped people and has already done, you know, these things that are considered broader impact, and, you know, has had a broader impact on their community?
Broader impact is sort of a loose term because there's broader impacts of your research, which translate as applications. So that is also a broader impact. A broader impact is also the impact you have on your community. So maybe do you have a program that you have for high school students where they engage with research, or do you have a program for underrepresented minorities in STEM and having them engage? Or maybe do you have some sort of creative program where you incorporate your personal interests into the work that you're doing? So I guess I sort of thought about all of those things. So I guess I could sort of go to each part of this. So I guess in terms of applications of my research, I kind of focused on energetic materials because that really defined my proposal this time. And I feel like focusing on the specific nuances of multi-scale modeling and the science of energetic materials, and sort of the fact that I was part of a school like Purdue that has a world-class center studying energetic materials, I sort of emphasized that in my proposal to say that I was not only the right person to work on this, but I was at the right place to work on this. And that's another important aspect, because they're not just funding you as a researcher, they're also trying to ensure that the institution that you're working at has the resources for you to carry out your proposal. So I sort of emphasized that aspect. And then additionally, I also had to focus on the broader applications of what I'm doing for energetic materials for other types of materials. So I guess last time when I wrote the NSF proposal, I didn't really define a clear class of applications. So it doesn't have to be just one application where I'm just going to study composite materials. Like, it can even be different types of composite materials. And you can talk about the fact that there's various heterogeneous physical systems that are being used in various industries. And the thing is that in all these cases, one of the main challenges is the efficiency in manufacturing. So that was another aspect, was making the connection not only with material science, but sort of some aspects that are related to the infrastructure surrounding these industries. So for example, talking about the fact that manufacturing is a really important industry, and especially during COVID-19, manufacturing bottlenecks proved to be a huge challenge in various industries. And moreover, in the context of particulate materials, a lot of these manufacturing processes are inefficient, partially because if you don't produce certain quality attributes of these particles, you're not necessarily going to have the desired mechanical properties for these systems. And sort of connecting it with a very applied context of what people care about in industry, in addition to just technological applications, was also important. Not just talking about products, but also processes, and sort of making that connection. And the fact that network science isn't just something where we understand a system, but we come up with new processes to design better materials. And that sort of allowed me to sort of pose it as not only a technique that I'm going to study, but also an application that I'm going to develop, not only for developing these energetic materials, but also the infrastructure and the manufacturing required to ensure that batches of these materials are resilient, and that batches of these materials have the properties that we desire. And I guess talking about it in that applied context would appeal not only to scientists, but also people in industry who are going to use this work. And I guess that was also illuminating to me in a way, because I never really considered those aspects in research, like how people are going to use it. Is it going to be used in a positive or negative way? And not only that, also what's the social implications? And I guess segueing into the second point about broader impact in terms of personal impact on people, right? So I guess in undergrad, I had a bunch of unique experiences with applying for grants at that time at a smaller scale for some of my broader impact initiatives. So I was able to highlight those aspects and sort of how that integrated sort of my personal interests as well as my academic interests. And in that context, sort of, I guess there were two main things I did. One was working on, for example, initiatives related to sustainability in the environment through my college house program as a biosphere manager. So I basically came up with events and professional development events through seminars where I invited faculty members from Penn and even outside of Penn to sort of talk about these issues in the form of panels. So I sort of highlighted what these panels were, who I invited, and what was the impact on students and how I measure those impacts. So I sort of really laid it out in a very precise manner. And then I sort of spoke about an inflection point that happened where I also wanted to integrate some personal interests that I had, specifically in the intersection of STEM and music. And I spoke about how I used my college house as sort of a launching pad for broader initiatives that I wanted to do through some grants at my school, including the SAC Student Arts Innovation Grant, and additionally the Netter Center Shop Prize, where I was able to sort of build a senior design project and additionally sort of broader outreach initiatives in the West Philadelphia school system where I could incorporate sort of music in the education of math and science, and basically sort of coming up with workshops and hands-on experiences where students could be exposed to the mathematical models as well as sort of the real world sort of analogies that you can see in music, and sort of seeing how these things can mesh together. And the fact that math isn't such a boring discipline, but if you can see it in this different light, that it can make a huge impact. And sort of, I was able to draw upon those broader impact experiences and illustrate what the impact was on people. Like, what did I do? What were the exact things that I do? Like, did I send out things to them? What was the format of the workshops? Did I borrow this idea from some other program that was happening elsewhere? So I sort of outlined all of these aspects and then eventually sort of segued into what was already happening at Purdue and how these efforts have sort of equipped me to sort of create these broader impacts. So it's not just about proposing broader impacts, it's talking about why you're invested in broader impacts and showing that you do care about these things in the first place. And then second, about how you're going to sort of incorporate that both in context of your research as well as your activities that you're going to do with people at your school. So for example, it would involve mentoring undergraduate students or coming up with workshops where you illustrate the applications of the code that you're developing to various applications, or maybe coming up with new undergraduate courses that sort of incorporate aspects of your research into pedagogy. So I feel like all of these aspects are sort of things that you should think about, not only just what research you're doing, but what is the impact on science and society? And additionally, what's the impact of your personal activities on people you're interacting with? So I feel like those are the two facets of broader impact.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to not just have like a list of things you've done, but like these are things that you personally cared about. You're not writing to show like, yes, I have done broader impacts, I hate it. It's like, you're showing like, this is an important part of who I am as a person. I think that's critical for the NSF and these fellowships, because really at the end of the day, they're funding you, the person, less so like the set of ideas and things you've done. One more thing I want to talk about is this concept of preliminary work. Preliminary work is important for these proposals. So can you describe what preliminary work is and the preliminary work that you did for these fellowships?
You shouldn't just propose an idea, but show that you can execute that idea. And preliminary works provides that evidence, because if you show a plot or a preliminary result that illustrates ideas that you're writing down in words, it puts pictures to words. And at the end of the day, people understand pictures better than words.
Yes.
And if you can show a nice plot that shows exactly what I'm thinking about, for example, in my case, showing how distributions evolve in time. So I can actually compute a distribution from my simulations, even if it's a very basic result. If it's an illustrative one, that's still better than nothing. So like in my case, I guess what I started off doing when I joined Purdue was just studying basically the evolution of defects and voids in these materials. And I was able to produce basically these distributions using code that others developed. And I basically produced visualizations of this. And even though they weren't anything quantitative, that still at least showed that I could do these simulations and obtain this information. So even if it isn't the answer to the idea that you're posing in your proposal, if it illustrates what your questions are, that's still useful. So any form of preliminary results, whether it's visual, qualitative, or even just a toy problem that you executed that illustrates the ideas, is more proof of a concept that you can show that indeed, when I apply to this bigger proposal that I'm working on, that I can execute these ideas because I know what they are and I know how to work with them. So you shouldn't just show the ideas, we should also show that you're capable of executing those ideas as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think these all, these were all improvements based on like, reflections you made, revisions in the writing process, actually doing the research. Like you went to Purdue and you got started. Like I'm a little bit impressed that you did 70% research along with 30% classes, because I think that's really impressive. So, going to it, well, just the whole point of this is that you ended up winning the NDSEG Fellowship and you've got an honorable mention in NSF. Those are both really impressive accolades. Why is that a big deal? Like, why is it important that you've won these fellowships beyond just like the award and prestige of winning something?
I guess there's even more intangibles than just the award itself. In a sense, grad school is a job to an extent. So you're basically working for an advisor. You're typically funded by a grant or a project, and it's often the case that you're constrained by what the grant's ideas are. The scope in which you can sort of invent your ideas is limited by the set of ideas and the overall infrastructure of the project that you're working on. And I feel like that's something to sort of overlook. It's not just like, oh, I joined a department and I work with a professor. you work with a professor on a specific project or set of projects, and that kind of defines really the scope of the work you can do. And getting a fellowship sort of relaxes those boundaries, because now that I have a fellowship, first of all, you don't necessarily even have to execute the proposal you wrote. The proposal that you wrote was a demonstration that you could come up with a project that you could execute, but no one is really holding you to that proposal. So I guess that sort of gives you the liberty to sort of think about really what are the passion projects that you want to do and how can you sort of incorporate it in context of what other people are doing around you. You also get, I would say, a much better funding package in general. So like the NDSEG pays almost 41K per year and also gives you travel grants to go to conferences, and you get to be a part of a network of these really elite, really focused individuals who want to make a tremendous impact on science and engineering. And I feel like being among those people sort of empowers you to do even better work. So it's not just about the fellowship award itself. It gives you sort of the agency to sort of take a leadership role within your group. So I guess now one thing that I'm trying to do is sort of work with other people in my program and sort of trying to get to know people from the classes I took and trying to see if I could create some projects with them using my ideas. So it's not just about like doing individual work for myself, but sort of lifting other people around you with the fellowship that you got. So it's not just a fellowship being awarded to you, although it is awarded to you, but the fact that there's going to be an impact made on others in the group. So for example, my advisor can now recruit some other students this year because I got this fellowship. And now that's going to provide me with more resources to sort of apply my ideas in various projects. And I think one important point, which maybe I didn't touch upon, is what do I do between winning a fellowship and hearing the award, right? And the thing is that the chances of winning these fellowships are pretty small, however good your fellowship is. So you can't count on winning these fellowships, but you still have to count on the fact that you can still do good work, whether you have a fellowship or not. And one of the advantages with having a grant is that it provides you that focus to accomplish those goals. So during my first year, I mean, it wasn't necessarily the things I wanted to do that I did, but the thing is, I still try to focus on doing that work well. So I guess my main goal was to accomplish significant progress on one of the projects that I was working on, namely studying defects and void collapse in these materials. And I guess my main focus was to sort of get to a point where I could have a poster or a presentation on all the work I did during my first year. So I really wanted to have an accomplishment that I had for this first year. So even if I didn't win these fellowships, I still got something out of the fellowship process, which was scoping my ideas in a way where even if I didn't win the fellowship, I would still have an opportunity to incorporate at least some of those ideas in my research. So I guess winning the fellowship or losing the fellowship isn't an excuse for not doing your work.
And that's a really good point, because I mean, at the end of the day, you put in a ton of effort, you revised these drafts. Like I said, you improved it significantly, you got clarity on your ideas, but there's things outside your control that you aren't originally cognizant of. With these fellowships, they're like, they only accept percentages of people. I've applied for fellowships for 2 cycles now, but I haven't found this experience unrewarding. I'm still learning a lot of different things and getting research experience, developing a tool set of skills and characterization techniques. Let's kind of wrap this up in the context of Viper. When you were a Viper student, when did you think about fellowships? Like, if you can reflect back on like maybe the beginning of this process, like what would you, I guess, recommend to starting or young Viper students or even juniors and seniors in Viper about this process?
That's a really good question. Honestly, there's so much I've realized looking back on the entire process. And I would say one thing that I realized was maybe I got fixated on a few ideas too quickly. And I feel like we get that tendency, especially if you work in a single group or if you're exposed to, I guess, a very narrow set of ideas. I feel like you've kind of constrain yourself in a way, and that doesn't really allow you to sort of explore ideas which you may necessarily not have an interest in, but might actually provide definition to your interests. One of the main advantages with undergraduate research is that focus and scoping of your work, because you're not doing that, but someone who's more experienced than you does that work for you. So the thing is that when you're thinking about these fellowships, that's kind of like the first experience where you have to sort of do that work for yourself, where you pick an idea, it may be really grand and very broad. And most probably in your career, even if you go to industry or government, you would be doing something totally different. And that's something you should recognize. It's the fact that what you're proposing for these fellowships and even the work you do in grad school isn't really going to define your career. Yes, you need to write a proposal that's based on your interests and that's well defined, but you shouldn't feel like, it has to be the perfect proposal. Having this open mind and sort of throughout the process, still keeping at it and working on things. So like even during your senior year, like still try to learn things, try to take advantage of professors, classes, and office hours to chat with them about your ideas, because those are really opportunities to get a different perspective from maybe your research advisor or your lab that sort of opens up really how you think. And another thing I would say that benefited me when I was sort of going through undergrad was interactions with grad students, because I feel like a lot of the students sort of went through these experiences. And I feel like when you talk to them about it, while you may not be able to understand really the complexity of these experiences, you sort of get a sense for really what you need to do to sort of set yourself up. And it's never too early to set yourself up. So like, for example, in my case with broader impacts, I never really thought about broader impacts when I was doing those things. When I saw those opportunities and when I tried to make use of them, just because I wanted to do something with those interests, it sort of morphed into something else. And I feel like if you give yourself the freedom to just explore and try these ideas and keep doing something, right? Don't just talk about it, but actually do something with those ideas and make it into a tangible project that people can see and that gives your idea some visibility. Then people actually get some interest. And that's how you generate interest. It's by generating visibility for your work. And you get visibility for your work by doing something, however preliminary or however basic that is. And if you do all those things, then you're able to set yourself up and also provide evidence for the fact that you can do the things that you're proposing. And I think that's really the key, is generating that evidence and showing evidence of success throughout undergrads, whether it's through your interactions in classes, with your professors, maybe presenting your work at a conference, or it doesn't even have to be those things. It's just showing that you can do good work and people can see that you're doing good work and write about it in their reference letters. And I feel like if you sort of think about those things throughout the process, then when you start thinking about applying for grad school, a lot of that work will have already been done. And it wouldn't just be like a bombshell at the very end where you're like, oh my goodness, how am I going to write a fellowship application? Where am I going to apply? Who am I going to work with? Am I just going to pick the person with the most citations? Sort of naive sort of mistakes that people make. Like you can avoid those mistakes. That's my point.
Yeah, I really wanted to highlight like this idea of like tangible stuff. And I think with tangible stuff, it doesn't necessarily have to be like a long list of awards or like a perfect GPA or something like that. It goes through a lot of the things that you end up doing in Viper anyways, like, you know, your first poster, your first presentation at a conference, papers that you can publish in undergrad, which, you know, not everyone is able to do. Did you publish a paper in undergrad, Abhi?
Nope, but I've been getting close to it, but never got it. And now I'm trying to get it now.
I feel the exact same way. Like, you know, Avi and I didn't publish at all in undergrad, but, you know, people in Viper have that opportunity. What I've always found the most driving and most motivating in that is doing stuff that you're passionate about. I think that's kind of the obvious one. But also, you mentioned this idea of just doing good work. And I think that's something that I find very helpful as well. Just, you know, doing something just to do good work. And, you know, oftentimes the passion and quality of the work are kind of intertwined. I guess I just wanted to ask you, Abhi, what was like the most important thing you've learned from this experience that you want to just sum this all up with?
I hope that this conversation was helpful for all of you guys, but I would say if there's a few main points to take away from this, and this is not even just for fellowships, this is just for how you sort of carry out yourself, how you make use of opportunities in undergrad, as a grad student. I mean, it applies to everybody. And I would say the first thing is, no matter what your circumstances are, try to find something to do. So like, even if you're not in the right context at first, maybe you're not sure about your interests, you still have to find something to do, because if you're not doing anything, then you get in the trap of the cycle of just thinking over and over and over again about what you're going to do. And that sort of is really counterproductive, because what really happens from that is that you just get more confused. You really lose clarity of your goals. And if you lose clarity of your goals, it's not really going to help you advance even toward anything related to your goals. And sometimes it requires you to maybe taking a slight detour. And that detour is okay, because it's often the case that doing something that you aren't necessarily interested in at first allows you to see an aspect of what your interests are that you didn't realize. And I feel like sort of seeing these different aspects of your work and even the limitations of your interests require you to sort of do something out of your comfort zone, and maybe even something you didn't envision yourself doing. Providing that sort of freedom to yourself and sort of encouraging yourself to sort of go out of that comfort zone is really important. And finally, when you write these fellowships, right, I would say you sort of fall into this trap where you think that, oh, your ideas are perfect. And that's never really the case. Even if you think your ideas are perfect, like when you read your proposal over and over and over again, you sort of get attuned to those ideas and you sort of become sort of resistant to change. And I feel I sort of had that experience where I sort of became so engrossed in my own ideas that I never realized that I had to iterate and sort of evolve, even like after winning these fellowships and when I was doing my research. And I would say that as an undergrad, and when you're sort of thinking about grad school or anything in general, even in terms of your career path, right? I think your goals keep evolving and they're moving targets. And I feel like you should sort of be flexible in that and sort of try to evolve and adapt yourself and iterate over and over again, whether it's through reading different literature, reading about a program, or talking to people about their experiences or what they're working on. I feel like if you do those things, right, that provides you opportunities to iterate on your ideas and sort of collect these thoughts in a cohesive way that when you have to explain it to others, right, you can explain it in a way that you excite them about the topic. And I would say that at the end of the day, this journey that we're going through is a combination of learning and teaching, in the sense that you're teaching yourself things, you're taking classes that sort of enhance your knowledge about different subjects, but then you're learning to teach these things. And that's what research in a sense is about, is you develop new tools, you develop new concepts and new ideas, and you have to communicate it to an audience who doesn't really know these things and really wants to understand why it's important. And I feel like developing both these skills will serve you well, not only for your own career, but also in empowering other people in enhancing their own experiences as well.
Yeah. Oh, okay. That's great. Yeah. I'm almost kind of inspired. So yeah, thanks, Abhi. And thanks for the people who are watching this recording.